great pleasure to introduce the woman whose creative work has brought us all here this evening, Eleanor Henderson. Most of you will have been introduced to Eleanor's work through her first novel, one of the New York Times 10 best books of the year, 10,000 Saints. It is an intimate portrait of a friendship cut short by a series of calamitous choices and the multiple hauntings that test the bonds of connection that we make with our own family and those we hitch ourselves to. Tonight, when you race home with your copy of the 12 Mile Straight and begin reading into the wee hours, you'll be asked again to challenge your conceptions of what constitutes friendship, family, and the capabilities of ordinary people to endure extraordinary circumstances. In the 12 Mile Straight, Eleanor carries these questions to the Georgia of Jim Crow, sharecroppers, fiscal collapse, and a moment in the history of the nation in which fractures of race burned visibly and brutally on black bodies in the South. At the extremes of poverty, abuse, and racial animus, Eleanor introduces us to Elma Jessup, the daughter of a white sharecropper who has just given birth to miracle twins, Gemini twins, one white and one black. The repercussions of this taboo birth shake Cotton County, Georgia at its roots and bring to the surface the ugliest and the most courageous instincts of the townspeople. It is the inconceivable parentage that will light the fire that backlights Elma's attempt to grapple with the secret history of her family's nature. The story of the sisterhood and friendship between Elma and her black housekeeper, Nan, poses a unique American question, one that continues today largely unanswered. Can the injustices of the past be healed by the sacrifices of individuals, one by one, putting the care, safety, and betterment of others before themselves? The 12 Mile Straight casts us vividly into a historical moment, and there is Morrison, Faulkner, and O'Connor in Eleanor's descriptive powers. But it will not let you keep the raw wounds of that moment at arm's length. Instead, the lives of Elma and her twins, her controlling father, Juke, and Nan feel as central to the concerns of our present moment as Trayvon, Philando Castile, and the torches at Charlottesville. This novel is a reckoning with the ills of a nation and an ethical demand for resistance and courage even when we are most fearful. It is also a paean to tenderness and kindness in extremity. If you are like me, you will find yourself changed in the reading of it. It is my great privilege to bring Eleanor to the stage to read from the 12 Mile Straight.
Hi. I'm a little terrified. Can you hear me? Chris is a little taller than I am. I told Chris, you don't have to write a long, luscious introduction, that I know that you're known for. And he said, oh, no, of course, I won't do that. So thank you, Chris. I can't thank you enough, not only for that beautiful, ridiculously beautiful introduction, but for helping to make this night possible. Jen Tennant and Chris Holmes were at my house celebrating their 10-year, and they said, where are we going to have Eleanor's book party? And they are both on the board of the Cherry, and they looked at each other and said, the Cherry! So hence this night was born. And I could not have imagined how full this room would be. My heart is as full as this room. Okay, so I think that I'm going to read a short excerpt. It's maybe 10 minutes. I haven't timed it. And it's the first time I've done this. So thank you in advance for listening. Chris, I think, set the book up pretty well, extremely well. But in terms of what you need to know, I think you know most of the things that you need to know. So the opening chapter consists of two main actions. One is these two twins are born, and the other is that the man who's accused of fathering one of them is lynched in the opening chapter. So it's a very short chapter. So I'm going to pick up right at the end of that act of violence, right after that has happened. So this is just a sort of introduction to the world of the story that takes place in this fictional county in 1930, Georgia. Cotton County was in the south central part of the state, an anvil-shaped box at the edge of what they called the Wiregrass region. There were acres and pale acres of sorghum and cotton and peanuts and corn, piney woods spotted with sandhills and cut through with the blades of rivers and swamps that made the sky seem even bigger, reflecting it like the back of a spoon. The rivers that ran north past the fall line ran rusty with red clay, but most of the clay in Cotton County was white as chalk. The Creek River was grand enough to power the Florence cotton mill in town, though 6 miles west at the Wilson farm, it was no bigger than your biggest cow, tongue to tail. That year, the drought had dried it little more than a creek carved into the shoulder of the 12-mile strait, which ran alongside the river like a twin. It was known to most as the Crossroads Farm, since it was where the strait crossed what was now called String Wilson Road. On the southeast corner of the Crossroads sat the Creek Baptist Missionary Church, and catty-corner to it was the Crossroads General Store, where after church on a Sunday, folks could be seen milling about on the porch, the Jessups among them. The Jessups had been the principal sharecropping family at the Crossroads Farm since the turn of the century, when the Wilsons built the mill and moved from the farm to the county seat, and the Jessups moved from the tar paper shack into the big house. They called it the big house, but it wasn't big. It was one of those single-story dog trots you saw in the country in those days, built high off the ground, split in two, with a kitchen and front room on one side and the 2 bedrooms on the other. Down the middle of the house was a hallway open to the outdoors, so the breeze could come and go and keep the rooms cool. A front porch faced the creek, and then over a plank bridge, the road, and a back porch faced the outhouse and smokehouse and sugar house and barn, which had a little cotton house attached to it, and the garden and the shack with stump-strewn fields to the north and to the west and to the edge of the acres dense with pines along the road. There were 4 mules and 4 cows in the barn, and 4 or 5 hogs that preferred the cool clay refuge under the house. The hallway was so wide the house almost seemed to be 2 houses, but a single tin roof covered both halves. On windy autumn nights, pecans blasted the roof like rain. Since the spring of 1912, when in a single week he lost his father to consumption and his wife Jessa to childbirth, the farm had been in Duke Jessup's care. He returned from burying his father with his people in Carolina to find 200 acres and a baby girl waiting for him. His mother had died the same way. Duke told Elma he'd have buried his own arm to have her resemble her mother, but it was Duke she favored. It was Ketty, the colored maid, who delivered the baby. She'd been a granny midwife since she was old enough to tie a knot, and she'd lost mothers before. Midwives is just delivering the Lord's wishes, she said. But she wore Jessa's loss hard. She washed her friend and prayed over her and dressed her in a wedding gown and took care of the baby until Duke came home, carrying Elma out to the barn to suckle from the cows. She refused Maggie's milk but loved Ida's. It was just the 2 cows then. Until Ida quit milking, it was only hers Elma would drink. Duke kept Ketty on to cook and clean and look after Elma while he worked the fields with Ketty's man, Sterling. Ketty and Sterling lived in what used to be the Jessup shack behind the big house, the 2 buildings strung together with the dull flags of their shared laundry. It was the shack Genus Jackson would live in years later. That's the man who's lynched at the beginning of the story. Elma was 4 when Ketty had her own daughter, Nan, and 5 when Ketty cut out the baby's tongue with her scalpel so she wouldn't die like her great-grandmother and her grandmother, and when Nan was 12 years old, Ketty herself, cancer eating their tongues like a weevil through a cotton bowl. The baby was old enough then to wean, and Elma helped the poor child learn to eat milky grits with a spoon. When Elma asked Duke what had become of Nan's tongue, he told her, laughing, that Ketty had eaten it, for that's what coloreds did. Didn't she see what unsavory parts they took of the pigs each winter? Ketty ate tobacco, and Ketty ate dirt, so Elma believed her father. After she cut out her tongue, Ketty fed Nan dirt too, white clumps of clay she found between the road and the creek. She ate real food, but it took her a long while, and she made a good mess. The white clay was creamy, and it was free, and it gave her something to chew. Used to be, George Wilson would pay Sterling and Duke the same, for their work was the same. But after the boll weevil came, they were glad if they broke even. If there was anything left, it went to Duke. When Nan was little more than a baby, Sterling left on a freight train, saying he was headed for the steel mill in Baltimore. that men were needed now that the country was taking up with a war, that he'd send for Nan and Ketty when he was settled. The war ended. He didn't return. But he sent money when he could and a buffalo nickel every birthday. When Ketty died, he sent two, and Nan moved into the big house, into the pantry off the kitchen, and began doing the housework her mother used to do. Juke said, "No use having your pretty head get wet in the rain." He would give her a nickel, too, when she was good, and with her mother gone, she began to take over her midwife work, delivering the younger brothers and sisters of the babies Ketty had brought into the world. The money she earned that way came back to the big house, for they were meant to share. As for the shack, George Wilson came to allow Juke to put who he pleased in it, and to share how he pleased as well. And because he was the kind of man he was, Juke divided the fruits of their crops when there was fruit to divide. If he told the field hands he was overseer, and maybe he did from time to time, it was only because that was the closest word for what he was. The girls grew up working side by side on the farm, Nan after her chores and Elma after school. Why couldn't Nan go to the colored school in town? Elma asked her father, and he said, what tongue's she going to use to learn her letters? At picking time, Elma stayed home from school to help. She picked and she chopped and she plowed and she tilled, riding in her father's lap over the harrow while Clarence and Mamie pulled them, thrilling at the thrum of the disc spinning the earth beneath their feet. Nan did the listening. She was good at listening. And Elma did the talking and the telling and the singing. Elma sang on the porch and in the kitchen and in the fields, to the guineas and chickens and cows and mules, Amazing Grace and down in the valley and down by the riverside. She sang while she picked cotton and while she shelled peas, while she washed her hair in the creek and while she brushed it. She sang in church, though she didn't need church to sing, or even to praise God, since God lived in the sky and in the trees, Ketty'd like to say, in the dirt and the seeds scattered over it. Elma worked so hard her daddy didn't notice he had no sons. She was her father's daughter because she couldn't be anything else. She had the same mineral red hair as Juke and the same glass bottle green eyes. She had the same widow's peak over the same high sunburnt forehead. She had the same swift, steady way of walking, picking up her feet as though the ground were hot through her shoes, and always straight, even when she wasn't in the field, as though there were corn growing up to her elbows on either side. And she was tall, Elma was, near as tall as Juke. She wore 3 different dresses to school and to church, but on the farm she seemed mostly to wear her daddy's old Sears Roebuck overalls, the sleeves of her flannel shirt rolled to her elbows, a bird's nest of a straw hat perched on her head, worn clean through at the crown. From the road, looking out across the acres with the sun in your eyes, used to be it was hard to tell whether the body in the field was father or daughter. Nan wore dresses, though now she looked like a boy herself. She'd cut her hair short when she was 13, the way Negro men wore it, almost no hair at all. She was as skinny and dark as a shadow. That was the way Elma's daddy put it. Elma's daddy said Nan was so skinny because she ate so much dirt. There were times growing up when Elma wished she were as dark as a shadow. She liked the way the sun warmed the skin of the men in the fields, their arms and necks and cheeks glowing the color of sorghum syrup by summer's end. She hated her freckles, hated the way the sun turned her pink, how it burned her skin like paper. When she got a bad burn, Ketty mixed up a bowl of aloe and black tea and slathered her with it, which wasn't so bad because the inky jelly was cool on her skin and made it look darker, darker even than little Nan, whose skin was the woody brown of the paper shell pecans that fell in the yard. It gave her an idea. One morning when she was 7, when her father had gone to town, she found a jar of syrup in the pantry made from their own sweet sorghum. She stripped down to her breeches and painted herself with it, using the brush they used for basting. She covered every exposed inch from her widow's peak to her toes. When Ketty came into the kitchen carrying Nan on her hip, she let out a holler. Elma said, "Look, Ketty, I'm Nan's sister." The sorghum wasn't as soothing as the aloe and black tea, nor was the kerosene that Ketty used to scrub it off. She poured it right into the water in the tub on the porch, and it stung worse than any sunburn. "You like playing around like a colored child, do you? Lucky your daddy ain't here," she said, holding Elma's face and scrubbing her chin. "I won't be telling him, and I suggest you don't either." "He won't be mad, Ketty. He done the same thing himself when he was a boy." Elma told the story of when her father and his friend String, George Wilson's son, had painted themselves with tar to play like colored folks. That was the first time George had told String not to play with Juke, but it wasn't the last. It was true that it was Juke's idea. He'd found the tar in a pail in the shed. It was the tar they used to paper the shack. The shack smelled of it, and as a child living there, Juke had loved the smell, And later he loved it because it smelled like that day with string, and now Elma loved it too. Ketty shook her head and scrubbed some more and said, "You both crazier than a rat trapped in a tin shithouse. Ain't enough kerosene on God's earth for you fools." And then, her voice softening, she said, "I reckon I should be glad this ain't tar." Ketty sent her to the creek to wash off the kerosene. Now Ketty was gone, the only mother Elma knew. It was the three of them, Juke, Elma, and Nan, living in the big house. And though it all belonged to George Wilson, the house, the mules, the seeds in the ground, it was easy to think it was theirs, that they weren't true sharecroppers, since other than the Wilsons, the only ones they shared with were each other. They didn't struggle the way of the other Halvers hands down the street, farmers with 8, 10, 12 mouths to feed, who wandered from county to county each harvest, who even before the hard times came were on hard times. The big house had glass in the windows and rugs on the floors. The Lord had blessed them. "He'd think he mighty, 3 of them in that big house," a neighbor might be heard to say. And then the wife would remind him, "You ain't talk like that come slaying time," when he needed him to do for the hogs. And the husband wouldn't remind her because she didn't like to be reminded how much he liked Juke Jessup's gin. So the 3 of them worked the same fields, ate at the same table, shared the same Bible, Elma reading to Juke and Nan each night. And now that Nan slept in the big house, well, if they weren't sisters, what were they? Thanks.